Thank you for this invitation to come and talk to you today about human errors. The book has an interesting history, but I'm going to answer the question that some of you might be already trying to formulate is this a response to intelligent design? Am I writing to try to refute and destroy intelligent design? And the answer to that question is both yes and no. No, it's not, because I didn't write the book as a refutation of intelligent design. And in fact, if my goal was to confront intelligent design and try to destroy it with evidence kind of a thing, I would have written the book very differently than I did. And those books have already been written, really. I mean, lots of people have already written on that, and I don't think it needs any more refutation. But yes, it is an argument against intelligent design in the sense that poor design, as we find in nature, calls out for an explanation. So the examples I have in my book, another question I frequently get is, how do you define flaw? How do you define an error in the human biology or mind? It's real simple. It's something that says this needs an explanation. This doesn't make sense. This isn't how it would be designed if it were intelligently designed. That's really it. To meet my criteria of being a flaw. So it is a challenge to intelligent design just by its very nature, but I didn't write the book as that. And this has caused creationists to get very confused, more confused, I mean. Because they write me, I get emails all the time, and they write articles about me and about the book, and they say, but you didn't address this, you didn't address that, you didn't comment on this, you didn't respond to these. And my response is mostly the same in that just because you happen to hold a position doesn't mean I'm required to address it, right? They don't own the word design, do they? And they say that I've stepped into this debate by writing a book about design, but it's a fringe belief that I don't think anytime you talk about evolution are we under any obligation to address every single little fringe belief. So that's why, if you're wondering why I didn't make it a more forceful argument against intelligent design, is I just didn't want to give up the page space to that. Instead, I'm assuming if you bought the book and you want to read the book, you've already bought into this notion of shared ancestry, right? So that's your buy-in point, hopefully, for this discussion. So it's not a refutation in terms of how I constructed it. But why did I write the book? Why did I research this and write a book all about human flaws? Well, and this goes into the second criteria of what I include in the book and what I don't, is the flaws themselves are really interesting, and they really tell us something about our past. And so there are many flaws that were sort of left on the cutting room floor, if you will. I didn't include them in the book because they were just pure head scratchers. Well, that's weird, and we don't yet know what the story is. So to make it into my book, the flaw had to have that interesting backstory that informs us about our past. So the theme of the book is not that the human body is terrible, that the human body is worthless and non-functional and ugly. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying the human body has a past. It has a history. Now, if you want to find out about the history of the human species, obviously fossils and archaeology and anthropology are a good way to do that. But actually, you can look at our body as it is right now and find the signs and the marks of our past. And the flaws that I write about in the book do exactly that. They tell us something about how we used to live, how we used to be, how we came to be this way. And if you accept that notion, that these weird glitches that we have tell us something, then actually exploring those glitches has great value. You can live in better harmony with your body when you know a little bit about how it came to be that way. And I think some examples might be appropriate there, but and I'll be happy to get into some of those. But the way the book came to be was, when I was writing my first book, I would come across little tidbits of things that were clearly animals doing something better than humans do. And that's all the list, the to-do list, or whatever you want to call it, that was the title, things that animals are better at than humans. That's how this started. And I would keep little things, and I was like, oh, that'd be an interesting book. And then sooner or later, it just became a list of flaws, of human flaws, of all these things, many of which have been written about before, some of which in my book hasn't been written about before, so I promise you will learn something if you read the book. But sooner or later, my list was several pages long. And so I was like, well, it's obviously not going to fit in my first book. It's its own book. But then I was like, oh, well, of course somebody must have written this already. There's no way I'm the first person to have ever written a book about human flaws. So I went in and actually, as I described flaws, nobody had really written about poor design in the human body, at least not a whole book on it. There are chapters here and there. Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Panda's Thumb, talks a little bit about poor design in nature. And of course, so does The Blind Watchmaker by Dawkins. He talks about it, but there's no book that sort of goes through the human body with these examples. So as a writer, that's your wildest dream, to stumble upon a book that hasn't been written yet, like an idea that nobody's actually written. So I stopped everything else I was doing to concentrate on that. And until I signed the contract for the book, I was sure someone was going to send me the Google. I just missed it. Here's this book. Oh, you mean this book that's already been written? I really wasn't convinced until I cashed the check that this was an original idea. So anyway, the way that the book is formulated is I go through different systems of the body and just talk about suboptimal design. Now, if you do accept evolution by natural selection and the process of mutation followed by selection as the means by which we are the way we are, then you shouldn't expect perfection. However, what I'm reacting against in this book are two big misconceptions, even among sort of normal people who believe in evolution. There are two ideas. So ever since evolution sort of replaced creationism, there's two big misconceptions that are still really common, even among people, scientists, people who should know better. One is this idea that we're all perfectly adapted for our environment, that every species is perfectly adapted for its niche in nature, right? That's not how evolution works. There's no such thing as perfection. I mean, in your mind, do an experiment of what a perfect animal would be. It evades every predator, beats every competitor, finds every piece of food, beats every infection and other, then what happens? How many months before they've eaten all the food and reproduced and boom, they're not so well adapted anymore, right? So even if you could have a temporary perfection, there's no way. And by the way, the environment is constantly changing, right? That's the story of life on Earth. And that's the whole Red Queen hypothesis, that every species has to constantly adapt, not to succeed, but just to not go extinct, right? Everything around you is constantly changing also. So we shouldn't expect perfection. We also shouldn't expect perfection because the way that change and diversity comes about is through random mutations, which are lightning strikes in the genome. And each one of those, to really progress, has to offer an advantage, or at least not harm you, right? So to grow a new arm out of your back, the only way you could get that is if every developmental step was truly an advantage. So that's a really unlikely event, and that's why we're all stuck with 4 limbs. You never see a lineage where 4 limbs, suddenly you get 6 limbs out of that, even though it would be advantageous, wouldn't it, to be able to use your hands for lots of other things. But developmentally, how would you come up with mutations that weren't harmful along that way? So evolution has these constraints: historical constraints, anatomical constraints, biochemical constraints, genetic constraints, and of course, environmental constraints. And because of that, evolution is a story of just sort of doing the best it can, incremental little advances, and it can create beauty and wonder, but what it can't do is create perfection. The second idea that I'm reacting against is the notion of human exceptionalism. This idea that humans are the pinnacle of creation, or the highest of all animals, and all these kinds of things. There's really just one thing that humans can do better than anything else, and that's cognitive reasoning. And even that, I'm not entirely sure is a benefit. Because no other species has doomed itself so clearly, at least right now. And in fact, the final chapter of my book does talk about that. Is our big brain the best advantage or the biggest flaw of all? Because imagine right now that you found out the human race went extinct 200 years from now, or is going to go extinct 200 years from now. Imagine how that might happen, just for a second. Now, I bet you, each one of you might have thought about our apocalyptic scenario differently, but none of you thought of, well, a new competitor came in, or we failed to escape our predators, or all of you thought of a scenario that's a problem of our own making, right? If we can imagine what's going to be our undoing, it's not an exogenous force. Even an asteroid coming in, we could probably deal with that. We're going to find out in enough time to deal with that. It's really nuclear holocaust or even a pandemic, a war, whatever, climate change, anything you can imagine is a problem of our own making. So I don't think the jury's out yet on whether or not our brains are really so great either, considering we don't seem to be able to plan more than one generation ahead. And why is that? Because evolution's never rewarded a species for long-term planning and self-control and considering the long-term consequences of their actions. So we're exactly what evolution has shaped us to be. So that's what the book is. It's not an encyclopedia, it's a story. Each one of the entries are stories. And your favorite flaw in the human body, you might not find it in the book, because I had to make choices of what would make the most interesting reading, stuff that would teach biology, but that also has this evolutionary backstory. So before I open it up to questions, which are always the most fun at these kinds of events, I'll just give you one example. And this is the one that, if anybody's read articles about my book, it's the one that people tend to read, so you'll have already heard this, so I apologize. But for all those of you who haven't heard it yet, did you guys know that the common cold is an almost purely human problem? And the symptoms of the common cold, including sinus infections, are not unheard of, but pretty rare in other species. Most other mammals don't deal with what the equivalent of the common cold. Now, you might all be thinking, oh, well, my dog has a lot of sinus problems. Are we talking about a Pekingese or a pug? Because that doesn't count. Those dogs were evolved, or I should say selected to have problems. But generally, animals in the wild don't deal with colds or sinus infections, at least not near the degree that we do. And the reason why is because we have some very poor design in our nasal cavities. Part of it, by the way, is, and I know some people are going to be like, oh, no, it's population density. It's true, population density makes all this worse because of how quickly we pass around these pathogens. But our farm animals have higher population density than we do, and they don't deal with this. They have other problems, but I'm talking specifically about sinus infections and the common cold. So the reason why we have this problem is that, so if anybody here familiar with the anatomy of the sinus cavities, I'll give you the short version. The largest cavities that we have are called the maxillary sinuses, and they're paired sinuses right here behind your cheekbones. They're very large chambers. And and you also have the paranasals and the frontals. You have the other ones too, but I'm talking about these first. So what do the sinuses do? Air comes into these cavities and it gets warmed and humidified, but there's also sheets called mucous membranes and that have a steady flow of mucus. And mucus is normally very thin, watery. It flows reasonably well. It is sticky, but it's not that viscous. Okay, why do we have that? To catch, particles, dust, allergens, and of course infectious particles as well, bacteria and viruses. And that's flowing from our sinus cavities, and then it collects and drains down into your throat, and then you swallow it to your stomach, where you can inactivate whatever it is with acid, right? Okay. And by the way, it's always just like a steady flow in the system. You guys know you have to clear your throat every so often. That's what that is, right? You get mucus that collects back there, and then you bring it all the rest of the way up, and then you swallow it. So I know it's not the most appetizing thing while you're all eating, but I'm sorry to break it to you, you're swallowing your own mucus all the time. Okay. Well, that's all fine and good, but these maxillary sinus cavities, the biggest one, the drainage pipe is at the top of the chamber. Not at the bottom where gravity would help you, it's at the top. It drains upward towards the paranasal cavities up here. And it's also, the tubes are really, really, really skinny. So what sense does this make? That you have to work against gravity every second of every day, at least that you're standing or sitting, to push the mucus upwards. And that's what you do. You push it up with these little cilia, which are just microscopic little hairs that come out of the cells, and it just propels the mucus upwards, and then it drains up there. So it works fine when you're not sick, but anything that gums up that system even a little bit, and the flow stops, and the mucus pools, and that's just a perfect breeding ground for an infection. And that when that mucus pools and festers at the bottom of the cavity. So why would our maxillary, what plumber puts the drain pipe at the top of a chamber instead of the bottom, right? You need gravity to help it flow. And we are unique in this, by the way. So even our closest relatives don't have this. So how this happened, and this is why I chose this example, not just because we can all identify with the common cold, but because the story about how it happened is so interesting. And so I think telling about our past. So mammals evolved from reptiles. Early mammals, the earliest mammals were reptiles, and in the reptile mammal transition, which is fascinating. We have some really cool fossils on that. A cool book has been written recently called, the word slam dunks in it, but it's about the reptilian mammalian transition, and I've read the book, can't remember the name of it, Julian. Anyway, interesting time. But the point is that most mammals are snouted, as our reptile ancestors were. We have long snouts. We don't, but most mammals do. And that's because most mammals operate mostly on their sense of smell. That smell is their chief sense for navigating the world. And your dog, assuming it's not a pug or a Pekingese, is like that. So you have you just could pack those olfactory receptors into these huge chambers filled with air, and their sense of smell is like 1,000,000 times more sensitive than ours. Your dog recognizes you by your smell much more than your sight. I mean, they really are. Most mammals are driven by a sense of smell, and they have these huge cavities, blah, blah, blah. Well, in the evolution of primates, and then again in the evolution of apes, we sort of switched from being driven by smell to being driven by vision. And we are very visually driven. We have a sense of smell, but it's nowhere near the other mammals, and our vision is far superior. Well, if you want to operate on your sense of smell, this big snout, which is totally blocking your vision, is a liability. So we smushed our snout in and we flattened our face to get it out of the way of our eyes, and we didn't need these big, large cavities anymore because we weren't using smell that way. So in the smushing in of the face, we had to cram all these cavities in together and smush them into the face. And also we brought the eyes forward, and that's what allows our nice binocular, three-dimensional vision. So it was a trade-off that we were happy to make because we have much superior depth perception and vision and all that. But we crammed the nasal cavities in. Now, different species of primates dealt with that challenge differently. Orangutans simply ditched some of their cavities altogether to make room. Chimpanzees, which is our closest living relative, have a very similar arrangement to us, but the drainage pipe is higher up the chamber. It's not at the top. I'm sorry, it's lower down. It's not right at the top. It's more in the middle, so at least it's a little better. And of course, they spend much more time in a quadrupedal posture. So gravity is helping them. We're upright, and the drainage is at the top, and the drainage is skinny, so we have so many things working against us. The flow is very easily impeded of mucus, so we get all these colds and sinus infections and horrible symptoms that we all deal with. So that's why we got there. But you might ask, as a good Darwinian thinker, well, how was this allowed? Why didn't evolution fix that? And the answer is because you don't die of a cold very often. Right? It's bad, it's uncomfortable, but it's not usually lethal. So you don't take the genes with you. You don't die of it and then take those genes with you. And that's the lesson of evolution. We are not evolved to be healthy. We're not evolved to be happy. We're certainly not evolved to be comfortable. We're evolved to survive and reproduce. Right? And if we have a cold every day along the way, as long as that cold doesn't kill you or stop you from being able to reproduce, it's there and it won't be fixed. So it's sort of an evolution's blind spot. And in fact, the book is filled with examples of evolution's blind spot, of compromises and trade-offs and glitches. I mean, some of the flaws in there are just outright glitches. There's no trade-off, there's no compromise, it's just a mistake, and we're stuck with it. But many of the other ones have these cool sort of evolutionary transitional sort of stories. So that's what the book is all about. And rather than just me continuing to drone on, why don't we open it up to questions? I know you wanted to start with some, but then we'll maybe take some questions.
Yep, we can open it up to the public now, and I have some questions that I prepared, and I'm going to use my advantage of having a microphone and being on stage to monopolize your time a bit. I think it's a great book. I enjoyed a lot of the things in there. Particularly one of my favorite part was where you had written about the abundance of vitamins in fruit and vegetable. I think in potatoes specifically, you mentioned that most of the vitamins are contained in the skin, which isn't something that my mom told me when I was 5. She said, you got to eat the skins. That's where the vitamins are. And I thought, that's garbage.
Man.
That's just an old wives' tale. And so you've you've proven my mother right, and she'll hold on to this forever now.
Give her my thanks.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is you're an active scientist. You do research, you publish, you teach classes, you have your review for articles. Why did you feel that this book was important to write for the general public, and how did you carve out the time? Because I'm a scientist, and this is it. This is my 5 free minutes right now.
Right. Well, Well, when I was a postdoc at NYU, which is where she is, I would not have had even 5 minutes. So the life of a professor is a lot different than the life of a postdoc in the sense that you are allowed a lot of freedom in how you allot your time. So my first book I wrote mostly when I was on sabbatical, The Best Invention of Academia, easily. And then, so this one was sort of written while the first book was under review and all, because it takes a long time to publish a book and you have outside review, your peer reviewers and things like that. So, but I know this is going to sound like a weirdly, like humble brag or something, but the book wrote itself. It really did, because these examples were so interesting, and the information, most of it was just really easy to find. I wasn't digging through archives, and I didn't have to like reach for all these disparate sources and I didn't have to do any experiments on my own. It really did write there were times when I would sit down, and at the end of an 8-hour day, I'd have a chapter, and it would need a little more work. I mean, obviously, when you write a book, you end up writing it 5 times before you're done, but the information was so easy to find. So it really wasn't a hard book to write. But why did I do it in the first place? Well, so I'm a teacher at heart. And so I see that teaching students and then also talking to the public about science are really the same thing. Same skill set, same philosophy, is to get you excited and interested, teach you a little bit along the way, but hopefully it changes the way you look at something. So since I approach teaching and writing in such similar ways, it was pretty natural.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Regarding human errors, the thing that I find most fascinating is to have a maximum impact when you move to the upright posture.
Yes.
Because it gives the advantage of us using the hands to focus.
Yeah.
And eyes moving up.
Yeah.
Makes the visual function much better.
Yes.
But as a result of it, I think there's a whole bunch of things.
Yes.
I think Sinus is one of the
Yes.
facts. But I'm sure there are many things that
Yeah.
got errors as a result of this tremendously fast.
That's right, and it's a great example because what I do talk a lot about the knees and the ankles and the back, about how we never really completed the transition to upright walking and little mistakes we made along the way, especially how we changed the shape of our backbone. We went with this S shape, and anyway, there's a lot of things that we could have done that transition better. But that doesn't mean that we're worse off for having stood upright. Standing upright has enormous advantages to it, and that's probably why we made the transition so quick. So remember, we didn't just come down from the trees and then go to the grasslands. We lived on the border for a while, so we sort of straddled the two worlds. But the ability to, as you say, stand and see over the bushes, just that by itself was huge. But also freeing up the hands and having more direct social interactions, more face-to-face. There's just so many advantages of walking upright that the fact that our knees blow out and our ankles are clunky and we have such lower back pain, again, that's the trade-off, that's the compromise. We wouldn't expect it to be perfect. But that transition from quadrupedal to bipedal walking is especially error-prone in my view because we did it so quickly. In the fossil record, it is really just like quadrupedal, bipedal. I mean, there are transitional forms, like I said, when we were living on the borderland, but it was really, really fast. And anything you do quickly, you don't do well, right? Anything you do quickly, you don't do carefully. So I think if we had made that transition in a more slower time frame with more time spent on the margins, then we wouldn't have, for example, this Achilles tendon that just sticks way out. The most vulnerable part of the joint, I should say the most important part of the joint, is also the most vulnerable, the most exposed and least protected. If you snap your Achilles tendon, like if you were to get cut, there's no recovery from that. Modern medicine fixes it, but I mean, before that, you were done. I broke my ankle in high school, and I would never have walked again if that happened even 100 years ago. So, yeah, we don't. But am I glad we walk upright? Of course. I mean, it's probably why we evolved all this other stuff that we're doing. It was secondary to that. There's another John Jay colleague of mine, by the way.
Of the unexplained flaws, which are the ones you think are in most dire need of explanation? And it's very severe flaws that we can't explain.
That we can't explain. So there's a big debate right now between the evolutionary community, I should say, and intelligent design about the wiring of our retina, right, which is the photosensing tissue in the back of our eyeball. Where ours is essentially wired backwards is the position that many of us hold, in the sense that our photoreceptor cells point backwards. I don't know if you guys know this, but your retina, the photoreceptor cells actually face backwards, and the light has to go through some tissue to reach the photoreceptor cells in the back. And every vertebrate has that. So when the vertebrate eye first evolved, it evolved from a pigmented patch of skin that invaginated, got pulled in, and there's just no way to fix it now. There's another clade of organisms, the cephalopods, that have a very, very similar eye that we have. With the lens, it focuses the light. It's called the camera-like eye. And they have their photoreceptor cells oriented the correct way. So their retina is installed with the photoreceptor cells facing forward like they should be, etc. So the great debate is, was this a mistake? Was this a flaw? And if so, how did it happen and why wasn't it fixed? And there's no clear answer to this yet. And I did talk about this in the book, because there's just no way to think that installing your photoreceptor cells facing backwards would be good. But is it a flaw? Because there are creatures who are extremely sensitive to low levels of light, so they can see single photons. A cat, for example, can see single photons, and they have a backwards retina. So is it a flaw? Does it require an explanation or not? The intelligent design community, they just simply point to the functional data and say, clearly it's not a flaw if it's working fine. But that's not really the question as far as I'm concerned. The question is, would it have been better the other way around? So I'm now working on a project to try to get some answers to this, is that there's another structure behind our retina. We don't have it, by the way, but many vertebrates have, to reflect light back up, so that if it misses the photoreceptors, those photons get bounced back towards the front, and then hopefully they hit a photoreceptor then. It's a way to sort of magnify the light, so to speak. By the way, this is what you see when you shine a light on a cat or a raccoon or whatever. You get but that doesn't happen with our eyes, right? Because we don't have that structure. So the question is, did this structure evolve to sort of make the best of a bad situation of this inverted retina? Did this little mirror at the back to concentrate the light forward is an adaptation to that? So I'm actually hoping to get somewhere on that question. And if you look at the fish that we believe we evolved from, which are the lobed fin fishes, not the ray fin fishes, which are most of the fish you can think of, vertebrates evolved out of lobed fin fishes. If we expect to find this structure in those creatures, because they lived in swampy, dark conditions, cloudy water, where every last photon of light was precious. So the evolution of this structure should have followed the dimly lit environments and so on and so forth. So I don't have the answer, but that's what we're working on.
Thank you. This is a question about aging. I guess we're certainly not designed to sort of exit the stage gracefully. Susan Jacoby wrote a book a few years ago about it. Yeah. There's this whole industry out there trying to convince us that our golden years can be our best years. Right. But, aging is a fucking disaster, right? In terms of the human body. I mean, after we pass reproductive age, nature just doesn't give a shit what happens to us. Would you say that's
Yeah, so in the book, I've read and written a little bit about aging. I don't discuss about any age-related flaws in the book, because I don't think it's fair to consider that a flaw. So anything that's purely age-related, I don't talk about in the book. But it is clear, that's the elephant in the room, that our bodies do slowly fall apart. But from an evolutionary point of view, it's super important for the long-term health of the species that new individuals be born and take the place, because that's the only way you adapt. Individuals don't adapt. Populations adapt over time. So you need a constant influx of diversity and new individuals so that you can be ready for whatever challenge lies ahead. Because all of us that are born, we're born as good as we're going to get. So if there's some new challenge down the road, if we're not the ones that can face that and succeed, then the species has no potential. So aging and the generations, we'll say it euphemistically, the changeover of the generations is absolutely important for the long-term potential of a species. So there's a reason why there's really no immortal species. There are a few ocean creatures and even trees that are sort of unlimited in their potential, but there's a few and far between, and they do eventually die, as we see. And importantly, they're not taking up space, so to speak, in the ecological niche, and that's why they've allowed these long lifespans in some jellyfish and other things. But in humans, all vertebrates, it's really important that we make room for the ones that come after us. And so aging, in a sense, is an evolutionary thing. The other thing about aging, though, is that it's also an evolution's blind spot because most of the problems with aging happen after your reproductive potential has already borne whatever fruit it's going to have. So most of the real breakdown of your body happens when you're past reproductive age, or at least through your most. So in that sense, whatever happens to you then, selection doesn't feed that towards the next generation. So sad to say that everything age-related is just in evolution's blind spot. And actually, evolving longer and longer lifespans is a good way to end up extinct. It's a good way to end up in the trash bin of evolutionary history because the longer your lifespan, the slower you are to adapt. The most adaptable creatures ever are bacteria with a lifespan of 20 minutes, or I should say generation time of 20 minutes, right? Because they are so quick to adapt because of that. Generation time is strictly tied to adaptability. Sorry.
I'm just curious about the relationship between disease and these flaws, because a lot of times I watch these nature shows, and it does amaze me how animals who are in often in very, very difficult conditions don't seem to get diseases to the same extent, and yet presumably they've evolved with flaws also because we've all evolved from other forms.
Yeah.
So are we more prone to disease than other
This is an excellent question, and I love this question for a variety of reasons. And for anybody who didn't hear, the question is, are we worse than any other animal in these flaws and our propensity for certain diseases? So this is conjecture. I'm now stating an opinion. I believe we absolutely are more prone to diseases and flaws, and I think we're more flawed than most other animals. The reason why, though, is it's a happy story. Because as we became more and more social and interdependent, and we had this complex social structure, and we were so good at doing different kinds of things that you didn't have to be good at everything. Your body does not have to be in tip-top shape to be a successful human being. And that's true now because of medicine and technology, but it's true for a very long time. The reason why is there's so many ways that you can contribute to the group. So if you don't have great vision, by the way, I see a lot of corrective lenses in this room, but if you don't have great vision, okay, you're probably not going to be good as a hunter, but you could be a gatherer, you could be a homesteader, you could be a shaman, you could be a teacher. There's so many different ways that you can contribute. Your eyes didn't have to be perfect. And the same thing is true for almost any part of your body, right? Whereas if you're an eagle and your vision's only so-so, that's it for you. That's absolutely it for you. No eagles are nearsighted. Zero. They have a 0% nearsighted rate because you're dead. But humans, you didn't have to be perfect. And that's what I mean by it's a happy story. Once we started having division of labor and relying on each other, there are fossils of people who had horrible, crippling injuries that healed and lived for years. So if they had a leg that was completely withered and no good, if you were any other species but humans, that would be it for you. But they survived for years because someone was taking care of them. And probably they were contributing something. In fact, the Dmanisi man, the fossils of somebody who had lost all his teeth, and this was before we were cooking food, and lived for years without teeth. What other way could you survive without teeth in that environment than if someone was chewing your food for you? So this is obviously an important person in his clan, his group, and talking about communicating diseases, but the point is that someone cared for him. Multiple people cared for him. And that's the happy story of human evolution. Our bodies don't have to be perfect because we rely on one another. There's different ways to contribute and all of that. So I think we've been taking care of each other and compensating for each other's flaws for a long time. But that means the flaws get through. They don't get eliminated by natural selection. So that's what I mean when I say we probably are more flawed than other animals because we didn't have to be perfect. And most individuals that are born now survive to reproductive age. That probably wasn't true for most of our history, but still a larger percentage did than didn't. I mean, it's hard to say exactly.
As a follow-up to that question, are other social animals, do they show a wider variation in abilities than animals which might be loners, say tigers or eagles?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly how we would quantitate that in terms of saying this one is more than that one. But it is definitely true that you have creatures, say like chimpanzees or gorillas. Those are two species that we know a lot about, where whoever's going to become the alpha, for example, is not, well, let's leave gorillas aside. Let's talk about chimpanzees. The alpha chimpanzee is not the strongest necessarily, is not the toughest, is not the, certainly not the meanest, is not the quickest, any of that stuff. The alpha chimpanzee is the problem solver, is the dispute resolution expert, the one who keeps the group together. Some of that is dominance and physical aggression, but some of it's being creative, having people like you, being respected, and knowing how to solve problems. So, and Franz de Waal, those of you who are familiar with his work, he's really pushing back against this notion of alpha male, meaning a brutish jerk. That's how we think of it in humans, but in chimpanzees, the alpha male is the peacemaker in the group. And you have alpha females as well, and that's their skill set, is a social skill set. So I think when you have social species, by nature, you have more ways to succeed and be successful. So in a sense, yes, I would expect social species to have more physical flaws, but they have these huge mental abilities. Whereas like orangutans, and let's stay within the same clade of the great apes, the orangutans are very solitary as adults, very, very solitary. So who are they relying on? I mean, they come together for mating season, and they rear young, but that's about it. Especially males, they are fiercely solitary. So yeah, they have no one to rely on. And I think that's partially why we didn't get, the evolution of all these things that we got in humans in that lineage. Because no one's good by themselves.
Are humans still evolving, or are we just developing technology and medicine?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Are humans still evolving? Definitely we've escaped natural selection for the most part. So, I mean, something like 99.5% of all the individuals who are born will live to reproductive age. So the scourge, we'll say, of natural selection, we have pretty much escaped that in most of the in all the developed world and most of the world. But that's not the only part of evolution, right? Natural selection is just one force within several forces of evolution. Right now, the biggest force is reproductive choice. So the future gene pool is made up of whoever is deciding to reproduce or not. So if you look at, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan and certain regions of the world, you have sky-high birth rates, just sky-high. And then you have Japan and Italy and Spain, where you have very, very low birth rates. So all we know for sure, in the next generation, the Pakistani gene pool is contributing more than the Italian gene pool. But that will be true for maybe one generation. And then 25 years from now, I'm sure all of these numbers will change, and so on and so forth. So we are evolving, but we have no idea how, right? And I mean, real evolution takes 1,000 generations. So whatever's happening now with birth rates, I think is insignificant in the long run. But what's interesting to me to contemplate is what happens when we leave this planet, right? Unless we really get into Star Trek kind of technology, it's going to take decades to get to wherever we live next. So you're going to have isolated human populations, some gene flow, but probably really different populations that are interbreeding, and we'll almost have like the beginning of the speciation. That's what I think is interesting to contemplate, because who reproduces when you have these small populations has huge impacts 1,000 generations later. So, I don't know. We are definitely evolving, but I don't think anyone knows how. But the reliance on technology is only forwarding what we've been doing for a long time, which is compensating for our flaws and not letting them be sussed out by the natural selection. He's waiting for the mic. Thank you, because not everybody can hear as well.
Well, it was just to follow up on the aging discussion earlier and how it's really it's okay that we fall apart after reproductive age because then who cares? But some people say also that actually grandparents were a great innovation in the survival of our species. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, that's definitely true. So the menopause is essentially what he's getting at here. So how do we explain the evolution of menopause? Because menopause is, until very recently, was thought to be a uniquely human phenomenon. Only human females underwent menopause. Certainly our closest relatives, they reproduce all the way until the end. And how could menopause have happened in humans? What would be the advantage of stopping reproduction when you still have some years left, and why would you not want to just keep putting out more of your gene pool? Well, And by the way, the early explanations for menopause were, oh, well, we're just living so much longer now, and so women weren't designed with all that many eggs. That's absolutely not true. When a woman undergoes menopause, she has more than half of her follicles still left. You don't run out of eggs. That's definitely not true. And also, by the way, if that were true, women who were on birth control, the kind of birth control that stops ovulation, would just extend their menopause out, and that doesn't happen either. They do have a delayed menopause, but not by very much. So it seems to be a timed, programmed event, menopause. And what happens is, this is the theory, but there's a lot of evidence for this now, is that the calculus of how you're spending your time and energy changes at a certain point in your life, where just putting out more of your own kids doesn't really help your contribution to the gene pool, because they're just going to compete with each other. But if you invest your time and energy and resources into the success of the children you already have and their children, which is generally when this happens, you're a grandparent by the time you hit menopause generally, especially in historical times, then that's a better use of the years that you have left. And so menopause evolved at a time when women did have a decade or two left. If they made it that late in life, because you're going to remember the average life expectancy of 35, that's because so much death happened before age 5. You get that out, there were plenty of old women and old men for millions of years. We had older people. So menopause evolved as a way to nudge women away from making more children and instead investing in the children and her children's children and their success. And how does she do that? By sharing all of the wisdom and knowledge that she's accumulated over 6 decades of life. And that's really precious, that social knowledge, that social wisdom. And so that's when the calculus changed, when you become so wise that your wisdom is more valuable than your biology, right? And the interesting thing about this is we're now seeing it in a couple of other species. So there's 2 species of whales that we have now documented menopause, the orca, the killer whale, and the right whale. And what they found is these menopausal matriarchs are leading the hunting packs because they know where the seals are. They've been around for 5 decades. They know where to go. And I think that's the perfect metaphor for the human experience. Who has all the wisdom in the family? Grandma. Grandma has all the stories. She knows all the things. And if this isn't a reason that we should be electing grandmothers to lead our country, I don't know. But we had a chance, right? But the point is that menopause is, I think, is a testament to our species' intricate social existence, where really knowledge and wisdom is the most valuable thing that someone has.
I'm not going to dispute any of the things you just said about menopause, but except to point out that one thing you didn't mention is that it is a phenomenon that happens to only one of the 2 sexes. And,
Right.
and you totally left out the other one.
Yes.
I might have asked, although I think you anticipated it at the end, could it also not just be a phenomenon that occurs later in life for the same reason that if you're going to get Huntington's disease, that occurs later in life?
And you're absolutely right on to mention that I did not discuss menopause in men because it doesn't exist. But the role that men and women have in the social group of humans has been different for a very long time. It's not identical. And like it or not, there's a lot of data that especially in older women, are much more sort of family-focused in their contributions than older men are. Now, everyone is probably thinking right now, oh, that's culture, oh, that's culture, oh, that's culture. And it very well could be. But there's a lot of evidence that says that older women killer whales, older female killer whales, are more group-oriented than older male killer whales. And that's why we would expect menopause in them. So in humans, I know this plays into a lot of stereotypes, but men tend to be, from all we know, especially looking at hunter-gatherer tribes, if we consider that as the best example of how we used to live, so to speak. If you look at hunter-gatherer tribes, men, and especially older men, are very self-centered. And their success for their progeny is in their own dominance, right? And we've got to remember that men can have unlimited children, right? They're not in any way bound by pregnancy events in terms of how fast they can reproduce again. One man can father literally thousands of children in his life with no sweat. Well, maybe there's some sweat. But if you do the mathematics on the calculations, the best strategy for leaving a lot of offspring for a man is to generate a lot of offspring and then hope that they work out. But for women, they have so much more investment over so many more years of time that the success of the offspring is a more important variable than the number of them. And if you put those calculations onto the menopause equation, it works out. That's my explanation. That's, I think, the dominant explanation in anthropology. But it does play on a lot of stereotypes. And how much of that's cultural and how much of that's biological, we'll never know. But by the way, cultural evolution didn't begin when we started building buildings, right? Cultural evolution goes back at least 15 million years. So I don't think it's invalid as before.
Hey, Nathan.
Hey, James, how are you?
So you touched upon it in your book and a little bit before when you mentioned speciation, when you were talking about like the different birth rates and everything. So my question, and actually more of, I'm hoping that you could expand on it. So in the book you mentioned it could be more so a cultural, evolution as opposed to actual evolution in that regard. So my question would be, is it even really possible for us to is it possible for speciation to actually occur because we're so intertwined? Like there's constant communication between people.
I mean, we're not going to split into multiple species without millions of years of selection. That's for sure, because it takes a lot more generations than that. And we know that just because we've had populations of humans that have been somewhat reasonably isolated from other populations of humans, and there's no problem with interbreeding there. So we're clearly one species. I mean, our origins as a common species are so recent that we're nowhere near speciation, nowhere close. But how that might happen in terms of the future evolution, it could be cultural, and that's how speciation often begins, as a behavioral difference. So if you have two populations of, and let's take the sting out of this, let's talk about birds. You have two populations of birds and they live on the other side of the river. How do they end up as different species? Well, it starts to begin as a behavioral thing where they just don't prefer each other. The song of this bird doesn't work on that species, or they're fertile at a different time of year. It always begins as this non-biological, just kind of happenstance, so to speak. You're waiting for a random event, essentially. But these random events are always happening. Now, whether that would still happen when we're making our reproductive choices a lot more consciously rather than just who succeeds and who doesn't, I'm not sure. But what we do know is that the human population, our most recent common ancestor, is not measured in tens of thousands of years, but in just a few thousand years. There's an ancestor of all of us just several thousand years ago. That doesn't mean that, all of us can trace our ancestry to that one person, probably 3,000 years ago. That doesn't mean the other people living didn't also have lots of descendants, but there's one that we're all descended from, even Australasian individuals. And they were already there. That's what's the interesting thing to wrap your brain around, but it only takes one migration event and then the gene pool spreads. So the lesson there is that it doesn't take much of that intergroup contact to keep the species together, even if you have populations that will evolve differently, as we have with racial and ethnic groups have acquired some biological differences. They're mostly visually recognizable because it was probably sexual selection, not anything real biological. And that could happen on an outpost in another planet where certain features make you more attractive. But unattractive people don't have trouble reproducing anymore, so I don't know if that would work either. That's a topic for another day.
When I was reading the book, I felt that there was an underlying thought of, as you said before, of history, of evolutionary history. I was wondering if you could comment on how, from the perspective of developmental biology and even some of the stages that we go through during embryonic development, how that informs some of our history and our relationship to nature in general and connectedness to other species.
Right. This is a very old idea that if you watch embryonic development, it's like watching evolution and fast forward. It's certainly with vertebrates. So you begin with looking like a very fish-like embryo, and then it looks very reptilian and so on and so forth. Now, that's, I think, been a little bit overblown, but the concept holds where you have a chassis, a developmental program that's very sort of generic, and then these little tweaks emerge which then grow into all kinds of other things, or regress. Our embryos have tails for a good chunk of our embryonic development. And then the tweak that came was the regression of the tail, right? But the default is to have a tail because your limbs, what would become your lower limbs, start to evolve much higher up in the embryo, and so you have this tail by default. And then you have a triggering event that leads to regression. But it's not complete, by the way. We still have the stump of a tail, right? Your last 3 or 4 vertebrae are irrelevant, right? And they're fused. And if you had them removed, so it's called a coccygectomy, to remove someone's tailbone, there are no side effects. There's no you can sit, you can stand, you're continent. You have no trouble without a tailbone. It really is sort of extra. What's interesting to me is there's also muscles attached to it, such that if you had a tail, you could flex it. But you don't. So those muscles, the program is still there for those muscles, the pyramidal muscles. And they can, and by the way, not all of you have them. Some of these muscles, there's some tissues that some of you have and some of you don't. I don't know if you know this. I mean, it's clearly vestigial structures that the developmental program hasn't completely sorted out. But again, if it doesn't cause that much trouble, then there's no pressure to sort it out. But yeah, I think Evo-Devo, which is the science of evolutionary biology put on the developmental program, has really enlightened a lot about how these evolutionary innovations came about in the first place. Because, like I said, why we don't have extra arms when there'd be such a huge advantage to having extra arms. But developmentally, how could you possibly do that and make everything still connect? Right? And so science fiction, you can always tell good science fiction movies. You can always tell science fiction movies that have a good scientist helping them get it right. If you look at the movie Avatar, forget about the actual blue creatures, whatever they're called, the Navi. Yeah, forget about them. All the other creatures there have 6 limbs. And they breathe out of holes in their back. And they all have it, depending what kind of creature they are. That's evolutionarily appropriate. Because once you have a big body plan, the vertebrates, for example, and the quadrupeds, you can't really make huge changes on it. You can just tweak it. So that's why when birds evolved wings, they lost their forelimbs. They didn't grow new wings out. They co-opted these. Same thing with bats and so on. So you really lose something every time you develop something, because growing something totally from scratch, just not easy to do. Maybe even really impossible. So that's why that was one thing I loved about, I didn't like the movie Avatar, but the one thing I did like was that they really tried to keep that consistent. Whether they're flying or on the ground or whatever, everything seemed to have 6 limbs instead of 4. And they breathed out of these things here because that would have all been inherited and tough to fix or tough to change.
Could you give some more examples of, I guess, adaptations that were positive that went away? So you named a tail as essentially one example, and another example that I've heard is that other mammals have more efficient muscles than humans do.
So you want me to give more examples, and then no one has any incentive to buy my book? Yeah, if I just give it all away. The categories of flaws that I talk about in the book, some are just unexplained glitches, some are compromises and trade-offs, and some are because we were evolved for a different world than we now live in. We were evolved for a different world than the one that we now live in. I think I said that right. And those are the more interesting ones that I think are along the way of your thinking. So like the most common sports injury is a torn ACL. The anterior cruciate ligament is right in the back of your knee. So, and anybody in this room torn an ACL? That's really common. The reason why is you have this, it's not the only ligament that bears the weight, but it's the only one right in the middle of your joint. So if you take the kneecap off, it's right there in the middle, and it connects the upper leg and the lower leg. And it's very thin, it's very weak, and it did just fine when we were spreading the weight among all 4 limbs. But when you now stand upright, it has to bear a lot more weight, especially when you turn direction suddenly. So this little ligament in each of your knees is really the only thing holding your legs together when you turn quickly. That was fine when our bodies were smaller too, right? When we had a lot less weight. But we are bigger, we are taller, and we're way heavier than we've ever been in our past. And this ligament doesn't get stronger with stress. It's not like a muscle that just gets bigger and accommodates. Ligaments are what they are. You're born, you can't strengthen the ACL. If you could, then that's what athletes would do, and they wouldn't rip them. So you have the ACL that probably worked fine for millions of years, and then now when we have these big bodies, they're taller because of better nutrition, they're wider because of poorer nutrition. And it's just more than the ACL can handle. So I consider it a flaw because our body is now, but it's not really bad design in the sense that it worked fine for what it was designed for, and now we use it differently. The same thing is true, by the way, everybody in this room except for him is doing something very not evolutionary right now, and that's you're sitting down. This posture is not a natural posture for the human body. It's just so comfortable. It feels great. But we didn't evolve sitting. Right? If you look at hunter-gatherer tribes, they might sit on a stump for a little bit, but generally, if they're going to relax, which they do spend a lot of time relaxing, they lay down or they lean against a tree. So sitting is actually not a very good posture for your body for as many hours a day as we do it. And so those stand-up desks that make you recoil when you see someone, you're like, oh God, what's wrong with that guy? He's standing up at his desk all day. It's much better for you. And by the way, I made the switch. I have a stand-up desk both at home and at work. And it was really hard at first but once you get used to it, I have not had lower back pain since. And I sleep better, everything. But I used to always have like this weak lower back. And then when you take a phone call, try to walk around your house rather than sitting down. All these things really do help because that's how your body was meant to work. I don't know if that answered your question. But.
Regarding sinuses, as a dentist, I know a lot about this, and we generally think that the nasal passages are what humidifies the air and helps with that. We haven't come up with a reason for the sinuses, for the paranasal sinuses.
Yeah,
is there any? The maxillary sinus, the ethmoids, etc.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you're aware of that could be?
I mean, I think that by and large, I think they do help trap invaders, infections, allergens, viruses, bacteria in the folds of the mucous membrane. But the fact that they're so reduced leads us to think that probably wasn't that necessary, and that the real function of the cavities were in those snouted animals was for smell. It was for concentrating all these millions of olfactory receptors and holding the air there so it really gives a chance for the odorant molecule to find its receptor and create a nice strong reaction there that can then be amplified and so on and so forth. I think if humans were to totally ditch their sense of smell, then I think the cavities probably would have been mostly superfluous, as you mentioned. But the paranasals, which are here, and the frontals for sure, I think, could go. And these are the ones that the orangutans don't even have, is the frontal sinuses up here. The paranasal, I mean, I think a steady flow of mucus, which is what they do, is important and probably saved our lives from time to time. But it's not as essential as it once was for our survival, that's for sure. And people who do lose their sense of smell live a nice, fulfilling life after that.
Just as a side commentary, I was taking an anatomy course a few years ago, and the anatomist pointed out what a great innovation it was that the ostium is up high,
right.
The communication between the maxillary sinus, because otherwise we'd have snots just coming out of our nose all the time. And I said, well, wouldn't that have been better when we were quadrupeds? He says, well, yeah, but it's good for us too. And I think creationism has a really strong toehold in the sciences as well as any other discipline.
Right, that's what I mean when I say that the vestiges of creationism are still amongst us even who aren't creationists, right? But they're the evolutionary descendant of creationism is still there in the sense that we expect perfection, we expect the anatomy to be exactly organized to what it was. But whoever said that in anatomy, I don't think that makes any sense at all. That if the ostium, the openings of the capillaries are called ostia, or singular would be ostium. If it were lower, it still has to communicate to the throat, right? Because that's where we send all our mucus. So just putting it lower wouldn't make it come out of our nose, but it would make it drain better. But if the whole cavity came up and got reduced in size, that would do better, I think. I mean, if you were to design this from scratch, you can think of 100 ways to make it more optimal. But that's not how evolution works. Evolution doesn't build from scratch. It makes tweaks and tugs, random ones at that, and hopefully it gives you a little bit better each step. But not always.
To expand with age, so the maxillary sinus at first is the size of teeth.
Yeah.
And then as our older patients get, the sinuses just expand to the point where they drape over the back teeth.
Yeah, essentially they expand to fill the space that gets opened up as the skull continues to grow a little bit, and then of course the teeth, the adult teeth come down, and the nasal cavities fill the space. And again, was that a positive or negative? Maybe neither. Yeah, it happens, right? And that's the most unsatisfying answer ever. That's how it worked out. But that's the truth sometimes. That's how it worked out. Something happened to happen, and that was it. And and you get creationism they'll twist themselves in all these knots to make it a good thing that it's that way. So one thing I write about in the book, there's a genetic disease you've all heard of called sickle cell anemia. And the reason why it's so prevalent in certain populations is that if you have one dose of this gene, you have resistance to malaria. So sickle cell anemia, it started as a mutation, but it gave resistance to malaria for those individuals who have only one copy of the gene. But if you inherit two bad copies, or two, let's say, malaria-resistant copies, you have sickle cell anemia, which is even worse than malaria. I've had a creationist tell me that that's good design because it protected those people from malaria. So think about what you must think of the designer, that instead of just not giving people malaria, he gives them sickle cell anemia sometimes because, what kind of design is that? That's the best the designer could come up with to fight malaria was sickle cell anemia. No, what it meant was those populations were stuck in an evolutionary tug of war between malaria and sickle cell anemia. Some design.
I wanted to just briefly come back to this idea about menopause, and that it's not ubiquitous among all species, and contrast that with the fact that I think it's unique that for humans that women are fertile every single month, whereas most species have a period of estrus, so they go into the heat, and the rest of the time they're not fertile. Now, was that only because our gestation periods are so long, and so women had to be fertile most of the year, or was there a different reason?
Right. So I think what it's connected to, our gestation time is not that different than the other primates, the other apes, although it's actually a little bit shorter than it should be. Humans are born early, basically. Human infants are sort of medium rare. They really are not ready to be born. And if you guys ever seen like a deer or a horse or a cow birth, I mean, they just sort of shake themselves off and they're running. Whereas a human child is dependent for about 25 years on the mother. Anyway, the point though is that we have a monthly cycle instead of much longer periods of estrous cycle. I think this is the dominant view in anthropology right now. That's a side effect of concealed ovulations. So other species, other mammals, advertise fertility. It's very obvious when the female is fertile. It's obvious to her, it's obvious to potential mates. And what we do in terms of concealing the ovulate to both parties is very unusual, right? So especially before we had like basal body temperature thermometers and apps and things, you really didn't know when you were fertile or not as a woman. And certainly a male wouldn't know by looking at a woman when she's fertile. And I think that was the important thing. And that's why we had to have cycles every so often, because most cycles were not successful. If the goal is becoming pregnant, concealing ovulation is a bad idea, right? If you want to get pregnant, then it would be better if everybody knew when you're fertile. But we conceal it. Why did we conceal it? If you ask me, is concealed ovulation was a key event in creating the family, the family unit. So lots of sex, lots of togetherness, lots of mate guarding is probably how it began, and keeping units together. When you didn't know when you were fertile, then you have a different relationship to sex. Let's put it that way. When you don't know when you're fertile, and that I think set up the battle of the sexes that other people have written about and things like that. So I think that was the first event, and then now we have these monthly cycles because each month is very unlikely to be successful. So, and just to show you how unusual it is that having sex not leading to children. If you take a mouse or a rat, any animal in that clade, rabbit, and you have a male and a female breeding pair, if you vasectomize the male, so the male's infertile but no one knows, put them together, after she copulates, she will begin pseudo-pregnancy. Her body will undergo all the hormonal changes. She'll thicken up her endometrium lining. She'll nest. She'll start building a nest. If a rabbit or a mouse or a rat has sex, they assume she's pregnant, because how could she not be? That's how successful their reproduction is. They reproduce like rabbits. And that's just not the case with humans. You have to, and in fact, a fertility doctor won't even see you until you've been trying for a year and you've not been successful. That's sort of the clinical definition of infertility or fertility problems is 1 year. So you have sex 365, maybe twice a day for a year, and if you still aren't pregnant, that's when we can take you seriously as having fertility problems. That's really unusual. So I think sex as an integral part of our social structure, that was the key thing, to make us have sex a lot and often and have battles around who you're having sex with. I think that was the key thing, because not only do we conceal ovulation, we largely conceal sex too. Sex is, for the most part in our species, is a private event, usually. And in other species, that's not true at all, right? Chimpanzees, gorillas, whatever, there's no hiding who's having sex with whom. And in fact, when there is sneaking around, that's when it's hidden.
I just had another question on aging. In terms of it being adaptive or not, I don't know if you know Peter Godfrey Smith's work. He's looked at cephalopod evolution and attempt to find parallels to human consciousness. But anyway, he points out that if you look at the very early species, they're essentially immortal. They just and he claims that what the research suggests is that most of what aging is are spandrels from adaptive evolutions, and it's not any one thing, obviously. It's a whole set of things that improve your chances of reproduction, but then long term they cause breakdowns like disease. So when you say that maybe it's adaptive to have menopause, and just going back to your idea that we're all still creationists at heart, when we do these sort of evolution stories, I mean, I think there's a tendency to create a just so story and then look for evidence. And I wonder how we do two things. One, determine something like aging. We want to look on individual attributes of what aging is and look how each of those develop. I would think would probably be the right approach. And secondly, how do we separate out the just so stories from the well-supported ones?
So lots to unpack there. The just so stories, and I know I'm guilty of a lot of these in my book. I try to say it when I am, but that just means that here's a story and it fits neatly with this explanation. There's no real evidence for the mechanism that you suppose, but it does sort of make sense. And evolutionary biology, especially evolutionary psychology, is filled with these just so stories. And I think menopause as the grandmother hypothesis, which is what that's referred to as, was a just so story for a long time. But its discovery in whales, I think, sort of proves the point that that there's something to this, especially not just that it happens in whales, but that the function of the older female in whales is to lead the hunting pack. Just to make a concrete example, that's what they found in the killer whale, right? And they did this statistically. It's much higher than the chance the hunting pack was not led by an older male, but was by an older female. And so it is just so, but with evolution, you have to just line up all the evidence and say this is the preponderance of evidence. And so the grandmother hypothesis, it fits nicely with the cultural stuff that we see of the doting grandmother. But we see that cross-culturally. So it begins to be evidence. When you see doting grandmothers in Samoa and Amazon tribes and Europe and Asia, and it's always sort of the same phenomenon. I mean, I have my own mother, when I see her with my kids, I'm like, this is not the woman who raised me. Right? She behaves entirely different. Something has switched. And, because she'll just spoil them and she'll do all these things that she would never have let us do. So it fits. And once you have enough of that evidence, I think it becomes believable. Now, to the other question you have, which is harder, about the mechanisms of aging, and especially if you compare with different invertebrates and so forth, which really don't have that same progression of aging. I think well, first of all biological systems will break down. I mean, so to avoid aging would be the thing that you'd have to evolve, because any cell, bits and pieces break down and have to be replaced. And so to maintain a body forever would actually be the bigger challenge, I think. So I think aging is a default. But the idea that we haven't evolved, that every time a lineage evolves longer and longer lifespans, tends to get it towards extinction. And the same is true with big bodies. So you have the evolution of megafauna, and then they disappear at the first sign, not the first sign of trouble, but the things that can survive the cataclysm are short generation times and small bodies. And so what you have is almost like catastrophism, where there's a natural advantage to big body and long lifespan, but then a big challenge happens and all the big things die and the little things take over. But what do? They evolve bigger and bigger bodies again. And so you have these cycles of extinction where longer lifespan and bigger bodies are the advantage, but not in the long term. And it's the same thing with sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. I find a good parallel there. So asexual reproduction is way more efficient. If everybody in this room could reproduce on her or his own, we would be much more successful if the only goal was to produce a lot of human beings. But they would all be clones. So you get very low genetic diversity. So whatever payoff there is in the short term, you lose it in the long term in a species with low diversity. And that's what when there are species, invertebrates, that can switch back and forth, and even some vertebrates can switch back and forth. What do they do at the first signs of trouble? Is they go to the sexual reproduction. Because that's when you don't want clones. You want as much diversity as possible to deal with whatever challenge you're experiencing. So I think the same thing is true with aging. There might be some short-term benefit to a long life, but in the long-term lineage of a species, you get less adaptable. So I put those all in the same category. Asexual reproduction, big bodies, long lifespan, they all doom you in the end. Not you, but your lineage. Is that enough hand waving for you?
One last question, then we're almost
Is there any mechanism for feedback in an evolutionary sense for populations that are outstripping the ability of their environment to support them?
So, unfortunately, I don't think there really is in the short term. There are some microorganisms that have what's called quorum sensing, and they're very aware of population density, and their behavior changes in response to that. And there's certain social insects that appear to be capable of that too. So when you have too many queens or not enough queens, and the behavior changes. We certainly don't see a lot of that in vertebrates, especially social vertebrates. So that the challenge of not overeating or overusing resources is dealt with by just expanding. And we've seen that in our own species. We were migrating and moving out in all directions. And that's really what we do, is when the group gets too large, the dynamics don't work anymore, and so they split into two. There doesn't really seem to be long-term, or I should say short-term recognition of long-term problems. And we saw that in the peopling of North America and Central America. As humans came across during the last ice age, towards the end of the last ice age, this continent, from north to south, had huge megafauna, had all these, from the three-toed sloth, the giant sloth, to the mastodon. I mean, we had all these big, huge creatures, and they all went extinct within 1,000 years of humans appearing, right? Because they were so big and easy to hunt, and also just a big, huge feast all at once. So nobody went for the varmints, right? They went for the big game, and all the big game was gone relatively quickly after humans appeared. And if you look at the story of Easter Island, the humans there very quickly arrived there, and within, 300 generations, they completely cut down basically every last tree from Easter Island. And because we don't think 1,000 generations ahead, we might think one generation ahead. By the way, though, on Easter Island, do you know why they were cutting down the trees? The main reason was to roll those big, huge statues. That's how they moved them around, was they got tree logs and lined them up, and it was like locomotion to get so talk about lack of foreplanning. Their idol, they were ancestors, but they were still, it was part of a religious belief that they had, caused them to completely destroy the only resource. I mean, because on an island, there's nowhere you can go.
It's happening now.
Yeah, we're doing it on the global scale exactly now. Everybody knows the problems we face. There's a few people in denial, right? And yet we're just marching along. Yeah, right. And the idea that science will always come up with a solution. Now, the good news is I think that most of the problems we face right now, science actually does have solutions to it. There are biodegradable plastics just waiting to be deployed. And you watch, with this plastic bag ban in California, they'll be in the market in no time, right? It's just been waiting. They're a little bit more expensive, though. So a tiny bit of profit margin is all it takes to make the horrible thing the dominant thing. So that's why we should all be banning plastic bags, not because I don't agree that they're really useful, but it'll push the market to come up with a sustainable solution, and it will. Same thing with solar power. I mean, it's just sitting there waiting. There's an Onion article that's like, scientists remind everyone once again, alternative energy sources, we're ready when you guys are. It's all, there'll be sacrifice, and people who are very wealthy now will take the hit, but there's nothing stopping us from going. We could be carbon neutral in 10 years, not without sacrifice, but we could absolutely do it. And in New York City, where you have the smallest area to population, I put solar panels on my house and I'm off the grid. In New York City, right? We don't get near the sunlight that you get in lots of other places in the world. And if you can do it here, and it's economically feasible too. My power bill last month was $35, and that was the gas. right? And we were running the AC the whole time. So, I mean, there's nothing stopping us from doing this, except for the will. We don't have the political will.
That's great. This is a nice place to kind of stop because you've been talking for a while. I'm sure you.
I'm an academic.
subject-
I could do this all
Oh,
day.
yeah,
We
yeah.
love the sound of our own voice.
So, as last thought, do you think? I know it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, but do you think that humans are going to develop more glitches, or will we take care of some of these glitches, especially given some of the new technologies we have, like CRISPR and ways to edit the genome?
I think we'll start to fix the glitches, but I don't know that we'll fix them in the germline. So anytime soon, anyway. So I think the earliest uses of gene editing, CRISPR technology, and other forms of gene therapy will be to fix genetic diseases, simple genetic diseases, single locus genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, hemophilia A. The ones that have a single gene, I think we'll be fixing those in the next decade or two. But we'll be fixing them in individuals who are already born. I don't know that we'll be fixing them in the germline anytime soon. I'm not so worried about, and our ability to fix those glitches will mean there's absolutely no selective pressure to remove them genetically. But again, I think that's a good thing. I don't think we have to worry too much about getting our genes right. And we can fix the worst of the genetic diseases, I think, soon. I'm not particularly worried about the whole designer baby thing just yet because we don't have the knowledge to do that anywhere close. I mean, if you wanted to alter someone's genes to make them taller, just something as simple as that, we wouldn't right now even know how to do it, theoretically, without causing lots of problems. Oh, sure, have more growth hormone. And then we know what happens when you have too much growth hormone. That's a problem, right? So every tweak you make will have unintended consequences. So I think we're so early in our knowledge of how the genetics and epigenetics actually create the person. Like, there's no way you're going to fix back problems genetically. Like, we didn't know which genes to start with, and all of them would have other consequences too. So I'm not really worried about the whole really eugenic side of gene editing, at least not for several generations. I think, though, it will be deployed to fix genetic diseases. So I think it's too early to try to legislate too harshly on this, at least on the research.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let's give Dr. Lentz a hand.